I really wanted to say when I was listening to who you all are, is I think I've done every single role of the people within this room. So, I am an academic, but I'm also a practicing clinical psychologist in the Maudsley Hospital. I've led service development and service delivery, and in terms of cognitive remediation, I've done all of the sort of original groundwork, thinking about what it was that we needed to change and identifying cognition as being a potential for rehabilitation, and then developing therapies with service users, and in fact borrowing from Australia. So for particularly Rod Morris and Delahunty, who had a very original program here. And then the point of being a clinical psychologist and a service leader is also that you move the therapy, not just from the realms of an academic paper, but you move it through into functional outcome, as has already been mentioned, but also into services so people have it. And that's really what I want to talk about a bit about today, is how we might be doing this. Hence, some of this was really useful for me because I could think about what cognitive remediation might mean for the future. But these are my disclosures, which you always have to put up before giving a talk. I just want to draw your attention to the bottom, which is I'm the creator of Circuit. So if anybody, whenever I come to talk about it, you need to bear that in mind. I might just be that second-hand car salesman, and you need to be highly critical of anything I say at that point. Okay, so this is the summary of my talk, and I will explain it as we get to the very end. Okay, so what is it, and really why do we need cognitive remediation? Well, the first thing is that there's a developmental lag. This is a developmental lag from studied by Larry Seidman. The red line is the cognition in people with psychosis, and the blue line is cognition in bipolar disorder, and the green line, you just see that? That's the one which is the usual, what you would expect from the rest of the population. And we also know that this problem arises at all ages. There's lots of studies of cohorts showing that in Dunedin, not far away, that actually cognition is important. We know that if there's a developmental lag in milestones, that you're more likely to end up with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. That's not to say that people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia are dumb. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that they are lower than you might have expected from the people in their family and their education. But it's also good to remember what service users say. This is Michael. He was 16, appeared on the television talking about his problems with psychosis. He'd already had 2 episodes, and he was just about to do what we call GCSEs in the UK. He ended up only getting low grades, and this, I think, is the most important thing. He says he's now coming to terms with the fact that he's got a learning difficulty. So he knows that he's got a problem. So in terms of his self-reflection, he understands that. But this isn't a problem that has occurred recently. We've known about this for more than 50 years, and we just did not pay attention. So 50 years ago, the Chapmans talked to lots of people in large mental hospitals and asked them what their problems were. And here there's lots of examples, but this one just says that their concentration was poor, they have difficulty in sustaining their attention, and they will just flip from one thing to the other. And this is somebody who's been in hospital for a considerable amount of time. But we really want people to recover. And people are not going around saying, I really want to improve my Wisconsin card test score. They just don't do that. This is the results of a survey by Rethink, which represents service users and their families where the service user has a diagnosis of psychosis. And here they're talking about the things they want, which is independence, work, maybe having a little job, life skills, and having fulfilling relationships with other people. Now, I'm not going to show you this, but there is evidence that cognition is associated with all of these potential outcomes. I'm just going to show you some of the studies that I did a very long time ago at Netherton Hospital. So at Netherton, the hospital closed. Just so happened I was doing some work there and I could follow people up over 6 years. It was a very famous hospital. It's part of the 3-hospital study of Wing and Brown, and it was known for having extremely good rehabilitation services. And as the hospital closed, they moved people to the highest level of dependence that they could. And the reason they did that was because it's actually cheaper to look after people when they're more independent. And luckily, I had data when I was able to follow people up who were moving from the hospital as it closed into the community. And what I found was that about 60% of the variance was actually associated with their thinking flexibility and the level of skills and level of illness that they had, their premorbid skills. It was not at all related to their positive and negative symptoms. Now, clearly, if you have a very odd delusion, that is going to prevent you moving on out into the community. But the levels of problems that this group of people had did not predict where they would be in terms of psychiatric services. But moving a bit more recently, you don't have to look at any of this except the line. Okay, so this is a line from cognition to the total health and social care costs, and taking into account lots of other symptoms like depression, antisocial behavior. And what it shows is that the most significant driver of health and social care costs was cognition for this group of people. So it starts early, it continues into chronic, when the disorder becomes more chronic. It predicts where you'll be in terms of how independent you can be, and it also costs more money. So you'd think that we would have actually done some work in trying to think how we might alleviate some of those problems. So we did. So that was the development of cognitive remediation. I've been a bit lazy here. This is a slide, ends in 2018. And I'll tell you at the end why I haven't done 2019. So there's a lot of data. So there's about 87 trial reports showing that it has positive effects. There are 20 meta-analyses up to 2018, with 18 of those 20 showing significant effects on cognition and or functioning, and some of them even finding symptom improvements. The reason I haven't updated it is that when I had a look at how many studies there were in 2019, my heart sank. I hadn't given myself enough time to be able to go through them all. So, but that is an enormous amount of data. So we now know that cognitive remediation, I think, we know that it works. The issue now is to get it out of those peer-reviewed publications and out into services that can be accessed by all the individuals who need them. This is a definition. I think this took, I'm looking at Alice here, it took us about 4 years to actually come up with a definition, and it's really simple. So it's an intervention targeting cognitive deficits. So does it improve cognitive deficits? Well, it does. This is the latest meta-analysis, actually, 67 studies, more than 4,000 participants, showing that over a variety of measures, except for visual memory, cognitive remediation actually improves all aspects of cognition. Okay, so, okay, it's a done deal. We have definitely improved cognition. But which cognitive remediation do we choose? If we know that it improves cognition, we really need to think how we're going to move it into the wide world. And there are a lot of different ones. Now, when I started out, I called it cognitive remediation therapy. The reason for calling it that was I thought it was like cognitive behavior therapy. It was just had a different outcome. But everybody thought that meant it was my product somehow. But it wasn't a product. It was just a change of a capital letter in the middle, CRT as opposed to CBT. But everybody's got a different way of approaching cognitive remediation. So what should we choose? Well, there are different ways of choosing them. So there's different kinds of things underlying them. So drill and practice or drill and strategy, and I'll tell you a bit about that in a minute. You could aim at general deficits, or you could aim at a specific one. You could do something called top-down versus bottom-up, but to be honest, I have really very little idea about what that means. This is just something people throw out into when they're discussing it. So clearly, if you're doing the top-down, if you're teaching somebody how to plan, you are teaching them attention. You must be teaching them attention. You must be teaching them some memory. Or, and this is another one that I'm still not sure I know what it means, compensation or restorative. So that's a bit about building strategies or rebuilding cognitive networks. So I'm just going to look at these two, which I think are probably the same thing. So words get thrown out. Nobody really knows what the definition is properly. But for cognition, which we know is improved, there are no differences whatsoever. This is an older meta-analysis that I carried out between drill and practice and drill and strategy. So for cognition, it doesn't matter what you do effectively. The drill and strategy is where you teach people strategic methods for remembering things, like, you know, chunk the information together or rehearse, because people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia often don't do those things. It's not that they can't, it's just that they don't do it automatically. So how about this one, general versus specific? So do we aim at everything, or do we aim at something that a person finds very difficult to do? Well, there's this study by Nicolas Franck in France, and turns out there weren't any differences, not in cognition and not in functional outcome either. So actually, specific versus general doesn't differentiate the different kinds of cognitive remediation. So what about this? This gets thrown around. I don't really, well, I'm going to go on and explore what this neural plasticity informed training is. People throw it in. It's a bit, well, it's another word that we don't really know what it means because nobody ever explains it. They just say it's neural plasticity informed training, like we would all know what it was. So let's just think about what that plasticity is. So it's about the dynamic organization of the brain, and it's about the ability of the central nervous system to adapt in response to changes. And most of the data we have, but not all, but a lot of the data we have is actually from the animal literature, not from people. So it also may involve actually responding to cognitive strategies, which would then affect the way that the brain will work. Or it could be the recruitment of new and different networks, or changes in strength of connections in the brain. And that's some or all of those are what people who say they're doing neural plasticity, you can tell by my tone of voice what I think of it, but that that neural plasticity informed training includes one or other of these things. So there was a paper, well, an issue actually in schizophrenia research last year about neural plasticity. And there are 2 papers in there. One, which was about the auditory system by Voss and colleagues. So what they said was, well, it's either reduced or excessive unregulated plasticity, so one or t'other. Then there's another paper which looks at transcriptomics. As soon as we get to omics, my eyes glaze over. I'm very sorry, so don't everybody ask me about it. But they talk about hyper or hypoplasticity phenotypes. So effectively, there seem to be 2 groups of people who have a diagnosis of schizophrenia and may have these sorts of problems. But it's either a lot of it or not enough. And we don't know which that is. So what about biology? I've got Christos in the first row. It's a bit nerve-wracking. So can biology tell us about whether cognitive remediation could change its plasticity? And I should own up, I've done 2 imaging studies. In fact, the very first imaging study I did on changes. But these are the sorts of changes that we might look for, so that you might get more activation, you might modulate activity slightly differently, you may find structural changes, the connectivity may change between different parts of the system, and you might be able to predict treatment outcome. And turns out we have evidence for all of these. There's other ways which we might measure it, so by genetics or by BDNF, which is an indicator of potential plasticity, but it's one of those now you see it, now you don't kinds of effects. So I don't think we have that evidence, but we do have some evidence that the brain does change after cognitive remediation. So that's my first one. There are all these others, and my answer is this. Because what does that tell us about what kinds of cognitive remediation that we ought to be providing? I don't think it tells us anything. All it tells us is if the outside of somebody changes, so their behavior changes because their cognition changes, that the brain changes as well. Well, wouldn't we be surprised if it didn't? So, and the reason is that we've called it, well, I never call it this actually, but neurocognition. It isn't hepatocognition and it isn't nephrocognition. You notice that I've missed the gut out here because, somebody's going to tell me it was really some microbial changes in the gut and we should all be eating carrots. And it may be in the future that we will be able to think what kinds of therapies the brain could tell us we ought to be providing. But we're really a long way behind with that because we used to think of the brain as blobs, right, as bits of porridge. And now we think of it as spaghetti because we think about it as nodes and edges. And if you look at these 2 studies, you don't need to read much about this. It was just the difference between the extrinsic network and the default network. And in one study, they did all of these tests and it was the same people that did them. And in the other study, it was different people that did each of those different tests. And it turns out that the activation networks are all the same. So they're not that different between different kinds of measures. So at the moment, it isn't telling us enough to decide about what cognitive remediation we should be providing. But as I said, is cognition really enough? Is it because we said actually that it should be targeting cognitive deficit with the ultimate goal of improving functional outcomes. And that's what we all want. People want these fulfilling relationships. They want to be able to potentially get a job or live more independently. So at the moment, with the way that therapy works, or the way that the system works at the moment, is we know that cognition predicts functional outcomes. We also know, and I haven't actually shown you this, but that cognition also limits the effects of any recovery programs that people go into. So, for instance, there's a study by Maurice Bell from Yale looking at how cognition predicts outcomes following a really good supported employment program, and discovering that people's work quality actually is much lower if they had a cognitive problem when they went into the study. But what we have been doing is thinking about this. So we provide the therapy in order to improve cognition, which then, of course, may improve the outcomes from a recovery program and general functioning outcomes. So originally we were looking at this bit, and now we need to be looking at this bit. So we need to think about it as a whole system. This is Lana's meta-analysis again, the MOMA. It's rather nice, MOMA analysis. And she shows that there's improvements in symptoms and functioning as well as cognition with this larger number of people. I'm going to come back to that later. But we need to know how it all works. So in terms of, we're thinking that you are improving cognition and then you get an improvement in functional outcome. So this is a study that we carried out on work quality. We found that cognitive remediation improved cognition, but it turned out it only actually accounts for 15% of the variance. There's a whopping 85% of the variance, which we don't know anything about. So that's an issue. What is that variance? And there's other studies in Spain showing a similar thing, that actually the cognitive improvements only partially mediate the functional outcomes. So it's not a direct link. There's something else missing. Am I going to talk about this? Oh, yes, I am. So mostly things don't affect negative symptoms. They do in some studies, but not in others. This is the doctor's database, and the cognitive remediation specialists got together with NIMH and created a big database to have a look at outcomes. So it allows you to look at far more things because you've got far more bits of individual data. So we're sharing. There are two parts to negative symptoms, so social amotivation and expressed emotion. And what you can see at the bottom is that there's no relationship. There is a relationship between cognitive remediation and working memory, but that doesn't have an effect on expressed emotion. Now, similarly, in the top one, it has an effect on working memory. Still doesn't have an effect on social amotivation. However, there is a significant effect of cognitive remediation on social amotivation. Now, I'm going to come back to what may be driving that, that relationship. But what I suppose I'm saying is that all of these effects are much more subtle than we've thought about in the past. So is it enough? People have thought about it just like this. You regularly exercise it, it's a muscle, it'll just become stronger. But I don't think that it's just your muscle. I think you need a bit of skill too. And this is my hypothesis, developed with Claire Reeder, was that you need to develop something called metacognition, which will actually provide stronger cognitive control. So why would metacognition be important? Well, one of the things that metacognition does, and if you forget all of the others and just look at the grey box, that it actually tells you not what the cognitive skill is, but when to use that cognitive skill. So, or a strategy, and why a procedure is important and what might affect it. So there are some times when you can just rely a bit on rehearsing something, but when you get really anxious, you may have to write down that information because you may forget it. So those are the sorts of conditions which might affect what kinds of strategies you might use to remember something in the future. And I'm going to put my glasses on because it's so small. So this is a study by Danny Corran. He's looking at the difference between people who are treatment seeking, that's the orange group, people who have attenuated psychosis, and people who are in that what he calls a healthy control group. And in both neurocognition, so in cognition and in metacognition, there are differences between the treatment-seeking and the attenuated psychosis groups and the healthy controls in both of them. But, now this is where it gets a bit complicated, which is why I need my glasses on. So if you want to differentiate people from healthy controls, it doesn't actually matter which one of those models below. You can ignore the models actually. They're all significant, so everything predicts the difference between attenuated psychosis and healthy controls. But the one that's the biggest difference is actually when you use cognition and metacognition. Now, when you look at the difference between treatment-seeking and attenuated psychosis, there are no models which differentiate them. However, if you... Okay, it's happened. Okay, the one that shows the most differentiation is the one that includes metacognition. So metacognition does seem to be differentiating something here. This is a paper by Cutler and Lysak. It came out this year, looking at the relationship between metacognition and cognition, showing that they're related. And this one is self-reflectivity, and this one's mastery. So different aspects of metacognition are correlated. However, we don't know whether it's the cognition that's helping the metacognition or the metacognition that's helping the cognition. It's an absolutely chicken and egg issue. All we know is that one seems to help the other. But it seems like there's relationships here between metacognition and cognition, and between metacognition differentiating groups of people with psychosis. So this is a meta-analysis, which actually, although I say it got published online in 2018, it's still in my inbox in my own journal. I haven't actually published it yet. He showed that there was a link between metacognition and functional outcome. So there's a link between metacognition and cognition, a link between metacognition and functioning. And he did this other study which showed that metacognition partially mediates the role of cognition to functional capacity, and it also fully mediates the link between functional capacity and functional outcome. So there are relationships here between metacognition and outcome, and I think this is the clincher. This is Abigail Wright's study. She looked at the relationship in first episode psychosis patients and found that metacognition and cognition predicted whether they were in work or not, but actually when you take into account cognition, the odds ratio is very high for metacognition predicting in work or not, and was significant. So there are important relationships of metacognition with functional outcome. Maybe that's what we need to think about in therapy. So again, going back in time, what we looked at in the meta-analysis in 2011 was the differences between drill and practice and drill and strategy. Now, you may remember when I looked at this before for cognition, there was no difference between them in terms of the cognitive outcomes. But actually, there is a difference in functional outcome that drill and practice did not significantly affect functional outcome, whereas drill and strategy, so a strategic approach, much more metacognitive approach, was actually significant in predicting outcome. So maybe this is a key to choosing a particular therapy. I hate this one. Am I going to? No, I'm going to just move on. It was good. I can tell you it was good, but it had really small writing, so you'd never be able to read it. But this is Mike Best's study, what he showed was that he compared perceptual processing training and executive training. And if you look at end of therapy, there was no difference between them. But if you look at follow-up, then the executive training actually seems to have an effect not only on cognition, but also on competence and functional outcome. I think executive training is actually metacognitive training. It's teaching people about strategies, and that is the key to transfer to a functional outcome. So, and this is where I'm the second-hand car salesman, hence the different title. So this is what Claire and I did in terms of thinking about how we would build metacognition into cognitive remediation. So this is the circuits therapy. It's built around a village, although why there's a multi-story tower block in the middle of it, we can't remember now. I think that was for doing your CV in. So we built metacognitive support into the therapy itself so that you have to make decisions and build self-reflection into it. But we also knew that you need recovery-based goals, real-world goals, so that the cognitive remediation makes sense to the person who's actually doing the cognitive remediation. So why should they do it? It isn't, as I said, in order to improve the Ware Wisconsin card sort test performance. It's about improving their functioning. And it's not just improving their functioning, it's improving what they want to improve in the real world. And it's personalizing those goals, I think, which is really important. We call them CogSmart goals because sometimes people do come out with things like, I want to pass my driving test, buy a Lotus Elan, and get married. And you just think this cognitive remediation just isn't going to go there. It's not going to help. So what you need to do is to negotiate the kinds of goals that people want. I don't want to prevent people having long-term important goals to them as a person, but just that the goals need to be a bit more relatable to the therapy itself. So what you do is before you actually even start to do the program, you have to say, well, how long do you think this task is going to take you? And how difficult do you think it's going to be? Then you have to choose a strategy. There's a sort of strategy box that you can choose from, which gets bigger as you go through. You cannot actually move forward without making a decision about a strategy. This is they're using a highlighter pen to indicate information that needs to be sent in a text to his sister to tell his sister about an appointment that he has. And then at the end, it tells you what your score is. Actually, that looks very low. I think that was when I was doing it in order to get a picture. We try and get people to have 80% correct at least over most of the studies. You also make a choice about how difficult you thought it was, and it tells you how long it actually took you compared to what you predicted. So this is all about helping people to be self-reflective and to understand sometimes things are more difficult, sometimes they're less difficult than you thought. And then you have to rate the strategies, which are all kept in the back of in the library. We can go and see. So, does it work? Well, it's worked in a lot of studies, and I didn't want to tell you about a lot of studies. I just want to tell you about the CRIB study. It's actually a study with bipolar patients. I don't know why I said patients there. I think because the last time I was to a psychiatry audience, but to service users who have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And what we found is that you had improvements at 13, which is post-treatment, and 25 weeks in cognition, and you got functional improvements at post-treatment and 25 weeks. This is a randomized controlled trial, so it's compared to treatment as usual. Functional capacity was only improved at post-treatment, but to be honest, I don't really care. I think it's a very odd measure, the functional capacity measure, and really what you want to do is improve people's goal attainment, and you need to improve their daily functioning. Okay, so it works. It also results in cheaper services. So even after you've taken into account the cost of the cognitive remediation, it decreased the cost of care by £2,000 as opposed to the £1,500 for treatment as usual. Okay, so there is a cost saving as well. It's always a good thing to sell to your bosses that it will save you money. And we also have looked at whether we've improved metacognition in using circuits. And this is Matteo Cella's study showing that metacognition actually improved more as you went through the program and at follow-up. So how does cognitive remediation work? Well, it works, this is our definition again, using scientific principles of learning. I think this may have been Alice's bit that she put in. But then when I came to think about it, I couldn't think what the scientific principles of learning were. So I looked at metacognition. Turns out metacognition's a really good scientific principle of learning. It can increase the teaching of reading, and probably most importantly, it affects it has an impact of about 8 months on schooling. It only costs £100. Okay, this is in a report by the Shaw Trust, which is an educational charity. So I decided to have a look at what neuroplasticity learning principles are. They talk about longer massed practice sessions for learning. I'm not saying that mass practice isn't important. It is, because you will forget things in between times, but they have very long mass practice, and ordered sequences where they only train one skill at a time. Well, turns out there are some surprising learning principles. So actually, if you learn in different contexts, and that's actually what circuits does, it teaches the same thing in different kinds of tasks. And actually, you can introduce desirable difficulties. So you can vary the conditions of practice, you can space and mass practice, and you get improvements in some parts of learning. And I suppose all I'm really saying here is that those neuroplasticity learning principles are not the ones that actually are very useful in teaching these skills. In fact, I went round the States talking to people here being the participants in the training where they were doing the neuroplasticity training, and the people who were in the studies who enjoyed everything the most were the people who were in the treatment as usual group who were doing the computer games, not the ones that were doing the neuroplasticity training. So are we missing anything else? And I think we are. Therapists. So this is actually not presented anywhere. I probably should take this out of the slide set. This is Mike Best and Chris Bowie showing that if you want to improve executive functioning, which is the thing which tends to have effects, then having a more psychotherapeutic approach, i.e. with a therapist, is the best way to do it. So I had are therapists important here, and I thought, no, just be definite. Therapists are definitely important, and there's evidence to show that they are. From that MoMA meta-analysis, this is where a therapist support is provided in the darker yellow, and where they're doing it independently. And you get an effect size boost with the addition of the therapist support. And it's most evident in working in verbal memory. It's a bit iffy in the symptoms and functioning, because there's probably a lot of other influences or factors on that, whereas the cognition part doesn't have so many influences. So one of the things that people have thought when you show them a computer game, and I tell you, I was dead against a computer game. I didn't want to do it. I just wanted to do the sort of more of a paper and pencil type therapeutic approach. And there are people in the world who still use that approach. But it was the clients, the service users that said, this is dead boring, particularly the younger ones, so put it into a computer. But then it looks like a game and not a therapy. And actually, it's definitely a therapy. So we know that therapeutic alliance is important. And it's important for whether you use strategies or not and the encouragement to use strategies. It's valued by the service users and particularly helps to perceive the treatment as usual, if the treatment as useful. If people think it's useful, they're far more likely to carry on with it and be engaged. We also know that engagement in cognitive remediation seems to actually also help to predict engagement in other rehabilitation or recovery programs. And we now know from Lana's meta-analysis that you also get a boost if you have a therapist involved in the treatment. But therapists need something. If you're going to go from having cognitive remediation, choosing the right kind, and having a therapist, therapists need to know what they're doing. What do they do? So we now have a website. We're really excited. It's only last week that we decided to launch one because we wanted to tell people about how to use circuits and training. And we have a training program. It's a bit long now, and we're just evaluating whether we need to cut bits out. But it has modules for telling people how to build the program and how to understand the background, how to set up goals. We have various videos which tell people about cognition, so provides a background. And we had some incredibly good actors who were able to be the service users in our videos. And soon, I hope, we'll have a proper thing. But we do need to learn from our mistakes. So this is lesson number 1. This is using well, what they call, it's now less of one of these, but what they used to call a neural plasticity informed treatment. It's a big study. They paid people to take part, which actually I've never done. There wasn't a therapist. And it's not moving. Thank you. And both groups improved, and there were no differences between them. And one of the reasons is probably actually that they chose these 13 off-the-shelf computer games where there was a lot of varied practice. So lesson number 2 is a study that came out at the end of last year, which is got a very long title, I'm afraid, but it's individual placement and support, or cognitive remediation and social skills added to this, or treatment as usual. And they found that adding cognitive remediation didn't actually make a difference between the two kinds of individual placement and support, although they were both better than the service as usual condition. In fact, if you look at the data, adding cognitive remediation was always better. It just wasn't significantly better. But if you look at even more, you discover that actually they only had less than 10 sessions of cognitive remediation, which is only a third of what they were intending. And 57 people in their study received 0. So we really need to look very carefully at these papers because they come out in important journals and they make people think, oh, well, cognitive remediation doesn't work. Well, it won't work if they don't get it. And that's what this particular study showed. Okay, so what's the mechanism? Well, cognitive remediation could change a lot of things. It could change cognition. It could change your functional outcome because of the strategies that you use. It could change all of these the only thing it can't change, some of these are variables that I know have an influence. It can't change your age, unfortunately. But maybe that the way in which all of these changes come about is because, well, first of all, these models are not exclusive. So one individual could improve via the cognition route or by the functioning route or by the self-efficacy route. They could all do it in different ways. But maybe what's similar is the metacognition, and that metacognition really accounts for the way in which there's transfer of cognitive skill or transfer of skill within cognitive remediation. And I said I'd tell you what the summary was. And the little dot in the middle of these boxes is exactly the same color. Okay? It's just the context that makes it look a different color. And I think that's why we haven't spotted metacognition for a very long time. We have had it surrounded by different kinds of context. So I think metacognition is is part of the mechanism for improvement. It uses scientific learning principles and they promote metacognition. That stuck again. Thank you. And that transfer only happens because of metacognition, and that therapists are really important because they actually encourage metacognition and those metacognitive changes. So I think for many reasons, one of the differentiations that we need to make in terms of cognitive remediation is this metacognition. Okay, thanks very much. And thanks to all of these people.